Today I'm going to tell you all a story that isn't going to be easy for me. It's a true story, but I have trouble remembering due to overwhelming emotions that always follow. I'm going to start from the beginning. It's going to be tough for me, but I wanted to tell this story eventually, so I guess today's the day. It's the story of my first and one of my most recent friends. I should start back when I was about 5. A girl who I'm going to call Jeannie, or let's call her Jean for short, had started going to my church. As a kid who was very antisocial, I didn't speak to anyone at church except for a few family friends. But this girl was determined to speak to me. She was 2 years older than myself, but acted so immature, even for a 7-year-old. Not to mention she would always cry if I didn't talk to her. Jean wasn't normally the subtle type either, so she'd make a lot of noise. She'd make a huge deal out of me refusing to chat. So eventually I just chose to give in and let her speak. I remember she squealed in excitement before starting to ramble on about cartoons, most of which I hadn't heard of or seen. Don't forget, this is coming from the guy who hasn't ever been allowed to watch SpongeBob. I still haven't seen any of it because of my parents. Eventually she started talking about Yu-Gi-Oh! I perked up immediately since I had been started gathering the cards a few months prior and demanded she talked about it more. That was when the first discussion we had ever really had happened. The entire conversation was about how Joey Wheeler, or as I called him, Joe, was the best character and Baby Dragon was my favorite card. Eventually, her and I became close. We even talked about everything. To think it all started because of a show on TV still makes me smile and how simple things kids enjoy. Over time, we got so close that I started sitting with her family during the church service. My family was usually late to the service since it was a 30-minute drive to church. So, Jean, being the person who hated to be alone, started waiting to greet me at the door and would then lead me to her family seats. Once I turned 8 or 9, I ended up starting to doze off during church. Every Sunday I'd just be so tired that I'd fall asleep. However, I could fall asleep anywhere back then, and it wasn't uncommon, especially when I was sitting. Jean would just poke me, I'd wake up, and then eventually doze off again. She'd poke me each and every time, and that was kind of the first time she seemed mature to me. She refused to let me sleep, because, well, you aren't supposed to fall asleep during church. To think at 10, she had that mindset. If it were me, I'd be too embarrassed to wake them up. When each time they returned to the world of reality, they'd snort loudly and startle people around you. Long story short, I didn't stop falling asleep. One time, one of the most interesting times, sorry, my head felt heavy, and it landed perfectly on her lap. If it were me now, I would have been too embarrassed to ever show my face around her again. But I was young, I didn't think anything of it. However, for some reason, she didn't wake me up. From what I remember, she just started stroking my hair, as if I were a cat or something. Her parents told me that I was like a younger brother to her, so I suspect that's why she acted like that. But when I woke up, I realized that this was the perfect way to get sleep. As long as I was placed perfectly, she wouldn't wake up. She wouldn't wake me up, I'm sorry. I was one diabolical child, and it worked. At least until her younger sister got jealous and started doing it too. A few months after I started having to sit through service awake, my parents chose to change churches, because my grandfather had become assistant pastor at a church that was closer to home. I rarely saw Jean for almost 5 years. We didn't have phones as kids, and there was no other way to talk to each other, so we just didn't. Then we suddenly went back to the church I'd grown up at for a small event. I walked in as a teen, like I was checking for a murder around each corner. I was nervous and anxious, but then I was unable to move after seeing something I had never expected to. Jean was wearing a beautiful blue dress with white frills, and I couldn't help but stare. I still remember that exact dress, and I will never forget it. She saw me and ran straight to me, crushing me with a hug that had no escape. I couldn't help but be in awe. I hadn't seen her in years, and she was beautiful. This may sound weird, but she smelled like the most girly of Axe body sprays. Yeah, it does sound weird. Anyways, we had a service before the event actually started. So I sat next to her, like the old times. And that's when she did something that made me freak the F out. She poked me and whispered to me, "You can sleep on my lap if you want." Now I was 13, and how would a 13-year-old react to a stunning girl around the same age as him? Asking him to sleep with his head on her lap? Can you guess? Probably not, actually. You see, I was a teen, but I wasn't exactly having that perverted side of me come out yet. After all, I hit puberty pretty late. I ended up pouting and telling her I'm not a baby, and boy was she disappointed. She just wanted to relive those old times. She wanted me to be comfortable. As weird as it sounded, that's all she wanted. The next thing I saw is something I'll never forget, because it was something I rarely saw. I remember seeing her tear up a bit before moving on. I never really saw her just tear up. Either she had cried like a little baby, or she was perfectly fine. That was a bit hard for me. Anyways, after the day was over and the event had ended, she asked if I had a cell phone. I didn't, so I told her my home phone, and she ended up calling almost daily. I eventually got a track phone, and we talked even more. I would even text her while I was in class. Never got caught, though. I was a good boy, at least from what everyone else could tell. A few years pass, and something devastating happens. Jean is diagnosed with cancer. I visit her almost daily in the hospital. I actually still live in a small walking distance from the hospital that she was at. She tells me that I'm not allowed to cry, and if I do, she'll punch me until I stop. She was always like that. Her mom would usually stop by, and I'd leave them alone and return the following day. One day, I had broke down and cried, and Jean punched me, just as she had promised. I snapped out of it, and when her mom arrived, I left as always. But as I was leaving, I had just left the room. I could not stand the next thing I heard. It was the most tragic sound I could ever imagine. And it was only seconds after I had walked out. Jean started crying. She kept saying she wasn't going to be able to be strong for much longer. She kept asking her mom what to do. I remember running down the halls trying to find a bathroom to unleash the waterworks that had already started. I hadn't seen Jean cry since the day I refused to talk to her as a child. She had always been so strong, and even though I knew she had to have cried every now and then, I'd never witnessed her feel so helpless. It did more than just break my heart. You see, I had a crush on her for years. I made sure that I did everything I could to make her happy. Her and I would never be a couple, but I didn't care. If she was happy, I was more than happy. If she was stressed, I'd make myself stressed trying to cheer her up. but there was nothing I could do to help her this time. The feeling of being helpless to help someone else is the worst feeling I've ever experienced. I just can't stand it. When I returned the next day, it was very obvious she knew I had hurt her. She had a huge smile, and I knew it was fake. She acted even more positive than ever for my sake. Unintentional rhyming, but that's fine. Now, this next part is the reason why I chose to call her an odd name like Jeannie. She always loved Disney and had been watching Aladdin on repeat. She always had the VHSs of it. She asked me if I had a genie who could grant any 3 wishes, what would I wish for? I said I always had one wish, to help someone who needs it, whether or not they ask for it. Then I jokingly said I'd give the genie his freedom, of course. She chuckled and said that she had 3 wishes that she wanted to become reality. Please forgive me if I tear up on this part. She wanted to fall in love like the corniest romance movie ever. 2. She wanted a life of happiness for herself and the people around her. And 3. For me to shut up and tell her how I honestly felt about her. I knew she knew, and I jokingly just stated, I can't shut up and tell you. It doesn't work that way. Can't have both. I just remember the focus she had in her eyes. She had never looked so serious to me. I told her that I never wanted her to find out, even though I already knew she had. Especially since we were never going to be together as a couple. But I had to tell her that I had a crush on her. She sighed and asked why the hell I chose we couldn't be together without allowing her a say in the matter. I cried and I expected her to punch me like before, but instead she just slammed my head into her lap and stroked my head as I made a puddle on her on her sheets and her pant leg. My tears were all over the place. I visited for months, and this last spring she passed away. It's been almost a year now, and I still miss her. I remember locking myself in my room for almost a week before finally deciding that it was time to move on. Sorry. Now, as corny as it may sound, she was a genie who granted me a wish I never knew I'd made. I don't think I'd ever have met half the people I did if she hadn't pestered me to talk that one day. I don't think the story was too hard to discuss, but it is still very emotional for me. I know 100% that there are people out there struggling with loss or even just need to vent. Gosh dang it. If you ever want to chat, I've placed my new email in the description below. Please do not hesitate to contact me for anything. I'm here and I want to help, because she helped me, and I knew that she'd hate me if I hadn't done this. I had to speak of this eventually. Thank you.